Welcome today to a webinar organized, sponsored by the Women's Rights in Mining Group, focused on gender dimensions of child labor in the mining sector. This is a topic that personally I find very compelling and overlooked, and I'm thrilled to be able to moderate today's discussion and to welcome you all to join my colleagues as well from Women's Rights in Mining to look at the various dimensions and angles of this very important issue. I would also like to take a moment to thank the volunteers, everybody who's been involved in organizing this webinar. As many of you know and have been involved, organizing webinars is actually surprisingly quite a lot of work and a lot of logistics, and this was a volunteer effort. The Secretariat of the Women's Rights in Mining Group, as well as the members of the group, and of course, the Dutch Ministry and the government members of the Women's Rights in Mining Group as well. So thank you. I would like to alert everyone that this is being recorded, that the video or the webinar will be posted to the Women's Rights in Mining website for viewing afterwards. We are only doing this in English today. However, the video itself will have French and Spanish subtitling after the fact. So you will be able to read essentially the transcript accompanying the video at a later stage. I also encourage you to visit the Women's Rights in Mining website. The link there is at the bottom of the page to learn more about the tools that are available, the information that's being shared, and also it would be great to have new members. So you're also welcome to join the group and to find out more. So I encourage you to visit the website and especially to sign up for the newsletter so that you are aware and informed of any new and upcoming activities and opportunities and publications. With that, I'd like to go to the next slide, please, Peter. Thank you. So the agenda today, we have 2 hours, which is a great luxury to dive deep. We will begin with a welcome word from a representative of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Marga Wieneman. She's the coordinator of raw materials for the, like I said, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the Dutch Ministry is the entity that is the generous funder of Women's Rights in Mining and of KIT, which is a research institute that is acting as the secretariat. So it helps with essentially events like this, essentially any support the group might need, as well as the production of knowledge materials, etc. So we'll hear from her shortly. I will then present or do a bit of a walkthrough about women's rights in mining, a bit of background. I will turn to my colleague Dr. Piotr Pawlak after, who will speak about a new tool that the Women's Rights in Mining Group has been working on, is excited to share and hope others will make use of. So we're very keen on having it disseminated and for as many people as possible to know about it. We will then talk a little bit about the expectations of the webinar, and then of course I will turn to the panelists or the presenters, introducing them each in turn. They will each have a few minutes to speak, after which there'll be discussion and reflection. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Marga, please.
Great, thank you, Joanne, and thank you so much for taking the time to chair this event. As you said, it's all volunteer efforts, so thank you for your effort as well. Maybe very briefly why we support women's rights in mining and also how child labor sits within our policy here at the Dutch Ministry. As Joanne has already announced, and you can see on the slide, I'm the coordinator for raw materials, which is a title that doesn't say too much, but what we work on is making sure enabling responsible sourcing and responsible trade in minerals. And we also focus on improving ASM mining, not exclusively ASM mining, also LSM, obviously important when it comes to making supply chains more responsible. And currently we're also taking up topics such as climate smart mining, sourcing of critical minerals, so really that wide array, which I think is basically putting more urgency to the issue that we're trying to understand for a longer time, and that is, what are women's rights in mining? How does it work along the supply chain? And then what we found, and the reason why we support women's rights in mining, is that there's a bit of a knowledge gap to really understand what are gender dimensions when we look at the mineral sector and the supply chain. And although gender is one of the mainstreamed key topics in our policy, it doesn't mean that we are all gender experts. And what we found is some really fantastic gender experts, practitioners in the Women's Rights in Mining group who are now coming together and really trying to see how we can learn from each other. So that is what is the value of the group for us. And like Joanne said, if you are interested in that, please go to the website and find out what it's all about. Then the next step in really understanding not just women's rights in mining, but also how can we perceive other issues in supply chains from a gender perspective. And that one of them obviously is child labor. But here again, I found it really interesting. It really triggered me, this topic of the webinar, to dive deeper into how can we understand child labor from a gender analysis. And that it'd be important that we don't make assumptions about that we think, okay, it'll probably be this or that, but that we really hear from the field, that we really have research-based understanding of how should we perceive child labor from a gender perspective, and how is that intersection between women's rights, child labor, etc. Then what I did to prepare a little bit is go to my colleagues who work on child labor, because that's actually one of our other priorities in the Dutch ministry. And they actually found that question already very interesting, very inspiring to think about. So I think that is step one, just to start thinking about how do we understand this problem. Then very briefly, I won't take away from the discussion too long, but what we try to do as a way of addressing child labor, not just in the mineral supply chain, but across the board, is a three-pillar approach. So we work with enabling governments, capacitating governments, mainly through ILO programs. Then we try and support businesses, Dutch businesses, but also broader than that, to signal and address child labor in their supply chains. And then thirdly, we work in a program that's called, I have to say it right. Work No Child's Business Program. It's such a great title, I wouldn't keep that from you. That is to support communities from an area-based approach to address incomes, livelihoods, access to education, vocational training. And that's not just focused on minerals, but we do support one of the programs in Uganda that is on mining. And one, obviously, of the risks is that if we address it in one sector, the problem moves into another sector. So that area-based approach is actually quite important there, we find. So I won't keep you any longer. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'm sure we'll get some inspiration on how to take this topic further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marga. Next slide, please. So a few words about women's rights in mining as you're contemplating whether or not to join the group. So a little bit of background, and again, we encourage you to visit the website to learn more. It's really a collaborative effort, and the core group, I would say the founders, and at the moment, I would say probably the most active participants are those that you see there. So it's made up of researchers, NGOs like Impact, but also Alliance for Responsible Mining, Solidaridad, Action Aid, and others, as well as government representatives from Canada, the German government, and as I've mentioned, the Dutch government and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in particular. So it's a very collegial space. As I mentioned, everybody works on a volunteer basis because we're very committed to these issues. And so it's actually a very productive space and a non-competitive space. So that's quite refreshing, actually. So the vision of women's rights in mining is really to strive for a mining sector and for mining affected communities, women, men, and children in those communities to benefit equally and enjoy all the rights enshrined in internationally recognized human rights standards and regulations. And so this goes very much to what we're talking about today. There are child labor legislations, there's due diligence regulations, etc. There's a lot of effort being made to clean up supply chains, but are women, men, and children actually benefiting and benefiting equally from what those efforts are striving to do, which is very much about implementing human rights standards and expectations. The mission of the group is to generate momentum and action among and by different stakeholders in support of women's rights in mines and mining affected communities. And all of us that are involved have different levels of expertise, different experience that are complementary, where together we try to advance that mission. We've been quite active over the last 2-3 years, and some of the key outputs are, for example, the creation of a stakeholder statement on gender responsive due diligence in the minerals sector, for which, together with the OECD, the Minerals Forum, we've essentially managed to solicit commitments from a number of actors across the value chain, private sector, civil society, governments, where they commit to gendering their efforts related to supply chain due diligence. And that is something that we now monitor and try to encourage more signatories and more commitments, and we want to go more and more into the concrete as to what that actually means in implementation. We've also been very involved in integrating gender considerations with regards to standards and norms and practices specific to, again, supply chains linked to the sector, but also other standards linked to progressive improvement and just general formalization and improvement of conditions in the sector and their impacts on mining communities. So really the integration of gender in all those efforts. And unfortunately, this is often overlooked. And we try to bring international attention to the importance of looking at this from an inclusive gender, and I would say even an intersectional approach, so that nobody is left behind. And now I'd like to turn over to Piotr, who's going to speak about one of the most recent tools and efforts of the Women's Rights in Mining Group, which is actually quite, I think, innovative, but also useful for everyone. So I think. Over to you, Piotr.
Merci beaucoup, Joanne, and thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to some of you. I hope you are all well, and thank you once again for joining the webinar. My name is Piotr Pawlak, and I'm a senior gender advisor at Côte, Royal Tropical Institute in Amsterdam, and I am based in Washington, D.C. in the United States. And here at the Women's Rights and Mining Initiative, we believe that mining-focused knowledge and information sharing events are really a wonderful and great opportunity to draw attention to gender concerns. And so women's rights and mining have capitalized on that opportunity and developed recently and is delighted to launch today, in fact, a tool that allows you retrospectively assess the extent to which a mining sector focused knowledge or information sharing event was actually gender responsive. So the assessment tool has 4 main objectives, namely, firstly, to provide mining sector stakeholders with support in promoting gender equality, but at the same time, also enhance their capacity, particularly of organizations and event organizers, to become more gender responsive, including by ensuring that events that you engaged in, events that you are putting together and organize are gender responsive, and that drives a gender reflection and hopefully a gender change. The tool is also aiming to contribute to a body of knowledge on existing approaches on particularly awareness raising of gender concerns in the mining sector. The tool can be used by both the organizers, but also partners of events, including all types of organizations and stakeholders, multilateral organizations, INGOs, community-based organizations, and I think more importantly, also private sector, and can be utilized in all types of events, from large-scale conferences and meetings to really small-scale, small-level workshops, for example. Let me just switch the slides. Great. So the tool consists of 2 parts. The first one, which outlines key gender concerns in the mining sector, which can be an eye-opener for some in itself, but also a reasoning behind the tool. And the second part is really the key, the substance, which consists of a set of 43 questions organized along 5 key areas of inquiry to be used as a post-attendance, sort of a post-event evaluation. This can be either administered as an online survey, and you have an option to do so, or depending on the capacity and certainly needs of your organization, as a paper-based questionnaire, again, as a post-attendance or post-event evaluation, and can be certainly analyzed along the lines of those 5 key areas. Some of these key areas include diversity, inclusivity, content, topics, and decisions. So to what extent these have addressed or have mentioned gender concerns and addressed, for example, women's rights or women's concerns in the mining sector. There are also specific questions that are perhaps much more likely to be helpful to event organizers themselves about the venue, logistic, and timing. So to what extent, for example, these 3 dimensions have allowed a meaningful and equitable participation of women and other groups, minority groups, indigenous groups, and so on and so forth. All of these really will allow you to get a better sense of the level, the extent, and the degree of gender responsiveness of your meeting, of your conference, or the seminar that you're organizing, for example. Here is just a quick snapshot of some of the guiding questions in the tools, again, organized along the lines of 5 areas of inquiry that you can choose from when analyzing the extent to which the event was gender responsive. And with that, and on behalf of the Women's Rights and Mining, I'm really delighted to launch this tool, give you just a little bit of a sense of what this tool is about, and let you know that the tool is now available on our website. If you have any questions about this, you're more than welcome to contact me or anyone from the Women's Rights and Mining Initiative. Do not hesitate to access the tool, to use the tool at your convenience, and certainly to disseminate it among your colleagues, again, CBOs, INGOs, multilaterals, and the private sector mining stakeholders as well. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm passing over back to Joanne. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Peter. Thank you very much. And I just want to maybe recognize that the OECD Minerals Forum, the Secretariat, was the first guinea pig, let's put it that way, for the testing and the refining of this tool. And I think it needs to be acknowledged that they were very receptive to learning about how inclusive they were. So it's been a great learning partner for the development of this tool. So I just want to give a shout out to the OECD. Often, big intergovernmental organizations are a little bit more, maybe not as supple or open to this. So they've been a great partner. So it's much appreciated. It's been a great learning experience. Next slide, please. Great, so the webinar today, let's get into the substance of the issue, is, as you know, about gender perspectives and gender approaches or gender understandings of child labor. And this is something that has been maybe surprisingly overlooked. I think in the past, maybe the issue of child labor was looked at from the perspective of, women as mothers only, and that's extremely limiting, and perhaps even can have some, negative repercussions if we're only looking at it from that lens, because obviously not all women are mothers and they don't define themselves uniquely as mothers. There's a whole host of identities that make up a woman's experience, her lived experience in an everyday sort of way. But recently, there's been this, plethora of initiatives and interests, as well as legislative and regulatory changes around child labor. So child labor laws are very much to the forefront. And today we're going to talk about the gold sector. We're going to talk about cacao. We're going to talk about cobalt. And it's happening in all supply chains. I would say it's not just minerals. And so this is a very pertinent topic. But what's a bit shocking to me personally is that these labor laws, or child labor, I would say the laws and the regulations in particular, are often or tend to be gender blind. And so the effect on women's lives can not only be potentially, limiting in terms of realizing what the objectives of those laws are, but they can also have unintended consequences on women who are obviously more often than not in positions of relative disempowerment compared to others in society. And so child labor laws that are gender blind can actually have unintended consequences on women and have essentially, not be as successful as they should be if we are not integrating that perspective. So this is something we really want to dive into today. We want to also bring out to start really examining this and draw attention to it internationally in all these discussions, is like the importance and underlying the importance of having a gender integrated, gender transformative approach to child labor in order to avoid these limitations and pitfalls. So the way we're going to do this today is to examine 3 questions in particular, and each speaker will be speaking to these in different ways. So the first question is, why does the problem of child labor exist in the mining sector in the first place? And what is its gendered character? The second one is, what are the barriers and opportunities to address the problems or this problem? The third one is, what evidence is there about impactful, scalable, sustainable, gender transformative interventions addressing child labor in the mining sector? And what can we learn from other sectors? Obviously, we're going to be very focused on the mineral sector, but as Marga rightly pointed out, you can't just focus on one supply chain. If you remove children from a mineral supply chain, they will go to agriculture, they will go to domestic work, because child labor is poverty driven. And so it's not unique to one supply chain, and households don't just depend on a single participation in a supply chain to survive. So this kind of more comprehensive approach is very important as well. And today, when we talk about other sectors, of course, like I mentioned, there's going to be gold, there's going to be cacao, there's going to be cobalt. So we're going to be trying to bring in different perspectives from different sectors to learn across. When we talk about gender transformative, it's important to underscore that this fundamentally is about power. So what we want to transform is really women's relative position of power in order so they can have more say, so that initiatives and interventions can be more relevant to their lives, and to make sure that we can be supporting equity and justice. And so that gender transformative piece is really fundamentally about examining where power sits and how we can make sure that women have equitable access to it, to be essentially leaders in their lives, have a say about what's happening in their lives, and make sure that their interests and their experiences are reflected in new policies and interventions, etc. I already mentioned that it's important that this is about root causes. It's not just superficial, let's say, feel-good programming in order for really to get at child labor from a very deep, substantive level. We have to understand the root causes, which is why we're going to be exploring this today. And fundamentally, we want to change the narrative about child labor to be more effective, to be more impactful, and to make sure that we avoid the unintended consequences that I mentioned at the beginning. With that, next slides, please. Oh, sorry. First, a little bit more about the webinar. Yep, continue. A little bit about the webinar, just some basic ground rules. First, to acknowledge that these are sometimes very sensitive issues. They're potentially emotional issues, and people have different attachments to them. So just a recognition that that sensitivity exists, and to be respectful, and also to recognize the importance of self-care if you need to step off if something is too sensitive. So, this is a safe space for that conversation, and we respect one another and respect the sensitivity of the issue. The cameras, unfortunately, your cameras and your microphones are off for the participants, just to be able to manage the flow a little bit better. But the chat option is open to everyone. So feel free to introduce yourselves. We want, a flurry of exchanges and dialogue. So engage via the chat. As I mentioned, translation is not available, but there'll be subtitles linked to the distribution and the production of the recording. And again, a reminder to visit the website to sign up for the newsletter, and new members are welcome. Now, finally, I think we will turn over to our speakers. We've got a great roster of speakers today, and I'm very privileged and honored to be here with them. We have, first off, Dr. Cynthia Ozua-Bali. She's a social researcher at the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Alassane Ouattara University in Côte d'Ivoire. She has experience in research, monitoring and evaluation, especially as it relates to gender and child labor issues. And she's been involved in eliminating child labor projects in the cacao growing communities of Côte d'Ivoire. Next up is myself. I'm not going to take up much time, so I have kind of a bit of an awkward situation where I'm both moderating and presenting a little bit, but I won't be taking up too much time. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some work in the cobalt sector. And as I've mentioned, I'm with Impact, based in Ottawa, Canada. I'm trained as an anthropologist, and the arc of my 30-year career has been as a researcher and as a development specialist in conflict-affected areas. Angola, Bosnia, Congo, Haiti, Afghanistan, refugee camps. And my background is really in human rights and women, peace and security in particular. So I've worked on natural resource governance in the mineral sector since 2009 and since 2011 for Impact. Next up will be Christopher Hane Koulibaly. He is the leader of sustainability plans with a focus on human rights in the Department of Mining Sustainability Management at the Alliance for Responsible Mining. He's based in Envigado, Antioquia, Colombia. He has a background in international business and business administration. He has worked for Amnesty, the United Nations Initiative, the United Nations Global Compact, and Zero Waste House, which is an environmental organization. He joined ARMED in 2019, where he supported the development of the Craft Code and its implementation. He's carried out numerous trainings and is engaged in capacity building in mining communities of Latin America and West Africa, and other relevant groups and stakeholders on tools, methodologies, and protocols focused on the promotion and prevention and protection of human rights in the artisanal sector. And finally, we have Ya Opuku, who's a social development specialist with over 16 years experience in the mining industry in Ghana. He's currently the responsible mining program manager of Solidaridad West Africa, a civil society organization promoting responsible and sustainable practices in the ASM sector. Before joining Solidaridad, he was a consultant on ASM reforms for the Minerals Commission of Ghana. And he worked in the Community Affairs and Public Relations Department of Gold Fields, Ghana for over 9 years, rising through the ranks to become the manager of the department for its Damang mine. So it's a great roster. Just in terms of, I guess, the logic of speakers, so you get a sense of the flow. Dr. Cynthia is going to start with, from a research perspective, what she has done and what she has learned, again, in the cacao industry in particular. I myself will talk about some new, I would say, evidence based efforts to look at this intersection of gender and child labor specific to cobalt. Christopher and Ya both will talk about programming in their respective sectors, in gold, in I think in Colombia and Ghana in particular. So with that, I would like to turn over to Dr. Cynthia, please.
Thank you, Joanne. My name is Cynthia Ozwabai. I'm a researcher at the University Alassane Ouattara, and today I will talk about child labor in the mining sector in Côte d'Ivoire. I have much experience of child labor in cocoa, but there is a big similarity and some difference than in the mining sector. Next. We will talk before address the issue. We will talk of the context of child labor in mining. There is a state investment in the mining sector since 1944. There is existing law such as the Code minier to fight against illegal mining activities. And since 2013, the state put in place some monitoring system, such as the national program, such as other system to address the problem of illegal mining. And in this context, 429 sites, illegal mining sites, were closed in 2016. And what we have to know is the fact that illegal mining activity is a general phenomenon in Côte d'Ivoire, because in 2014, 25 regions out of 31 were concerned by illegal mining activities. 500 million of rural households are invested in this activity, and the number of these illegal mining sites is still increasing in the country. Next. The cause of the child labor in the mining sector are multiple, but we will focus on some which are very important. First is the poor sale of agricultural product, because the base of economic power in rural household is agriculture, but because of some factors that economic crisis, like climate change, households face to poor sale of their products. The second cause is the need of multiple economic sources in households to support family, to mitigate poverty risk, and the lack of other economic opportunities for the family and household in the area where there is mining sites. And the last reason is of investment of child in the mining sector is because the workforce are not expensive in comparison to adults workforce. Next. How does child labor in mining look like? What I can say is the fact that there is a kind of sexual labor division in mining sector. Both boys and girls act differently. First, boys are involved into the transport of mineral, into the control of the washing step, into the mineral extraction, and into digging. And girls are involved into washing minerals, but there is other activities around the direct mining activities in which girls are involved in, such as sex working, selling product and food in mining sites, and also housework, which can be in some cases considered as child labor. Next. The impact of child labor on boys and girls. First, we will focus on the similar impact on both boys and girls. First impact is the gender-based violence to improve their productivity, the productivity of children. So, and children can face to physical violence or oral violence. And there is also unschooling for both boys and girls, because children spend much time in the mining sites, and also because of economic difficulties their parents face, they can't be able to go to school. And the third similar consequence, is a health issue for both boys and girls. And in terms of difference, in terms of consequences, I focus on girls, because girls face to sex work, so they are exposed to some diseases related to the activity, such as sexual transmitted infection. They also face to sexual violence. It is not directly linking to mining activity, but it is activities which is developed around the mining sites. So I think it is can be considered as a consequence for girl. Next. In terms of barrier to address, the child labor in mining is the main barrier is the influence of stakeholders which have the interest in promoting this activity. Among these stakeholders, there is community, there is families, parents, there is also illegal mining site owners for whom child labor constitutes an economic opportunity. And in terms of opportunity to address child labor in mining, we have a big investment of state and also non-state actors to deal with child labor in mining in cocoa growing community. So training sessions are organized, information sharing and social dialogue are also organized to sensitize the population on this issue. In terms of evidence, before talking about the evidence, it is important to know that we have to make a stakeholder analysis in child labor in mining to address the issue, because there is many interests. And the second point is that this issue, child labor in mining, is less addressed than child labor in cocoa. In Côte d'Ivoire, there is many organizations which are already focused on child labor in cocoa because maybe of economic opportunity, and also because of political strategies. But this issue in mining is less addressed. But there is some organization such as state, we have already talked about it. There is also International Labour Organization and some other stakeholders which are invested in child labor in the mining sector. They organize trading sessions. The state have put in place a monitoring system, and some actors such as the researcher are also invested in the sector because they make research on demand by NGOs, by state, to address the issue. Thank you. I think it's all for my concerning my topic of l'anglais. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci. I know it's not easy speaking in a second or third language, so congratulations. That was excellent. It was very clear. I did, if I'm going to abuse my position of privilege here as moderator for a second to ask you a follow-up question. You mentioned the influence of stakeholders as a barrier to addressing child labor because they benefit economically. Can you explain who those stakeholders are or provide examples?
There is in the mine, because there is many, if I can say, step of child labor. There is child labor at the ground level, which are the parents first, the owner of the mining sites, because what I've said in the beginning is the fact that children constitute an inexpensive workforce. So it's an advantage for this owner to employ children. They also constitute an economic force for the household and for the families. So they have interests to put their children in this activity. And for me, it's important to understand the influence and the interest in all the system to better give to better address this issue. There is also another kind of stakeholders at the national level or at the mid level, but we have, and for it's important to have a kind of holistic approach to integrate all the, to have a multi-level analysis to better understand the issue and address it.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you. That's very clear and helpful. Thanks, Cynthia. Next slide, Peter, please. I think I'm up. Yeah. Okay. Very good. I'll try not to monopolize too much time because we do want to hear from the others. But I am privileged also to talk a little bit about some of the work that Impact is doing in this sector and in Cobalt as well, which is perhaps brings a different dimension. Here's a little bit about Impact. You can go to our website to learn more. But we have existed since 1986. We were formerly called Partnership Africa Canada. We rebranded in 2017. And we've been working on responsible natural resource management, governance since at least 25 years, and really starting with diamonds. And so we were one of the founders of the Kimberley process, for which we were nominated for Nobel Peace Prize. And we've worked in many other commodities since, primarily mineral. And our areas of focus there, as you see, regulatory and legal reform, supply chain transparency, illicit trade and financing, environmental stewardship, and of course, gender equality, which is something that is personally very important to me with somebody from a women, peace, and security background. And so we integrate that across all our programming. Next slide, please. So we've worked on women's empowerment, particularly women's political and economic empowerment and natural resources in the mineral sector in particular for, I would say, about 7 or 8 years now. Our efforts and our projects were pointing to increasingly this link potentially between women's security, economic security, and potentially links to incidents of child labor, but it was unexplored. And we are not experts in child labor. And so we've partnered with a number of organizations to try to build that expertise and look at that intersection. So we started with a desk-based research. We were working with many students to do this, and they looked across many sectors, but in the mining sector in particular, globally, to look at what kind of research had been done between security and economic security in particular, and incidences of child labor in supply chains or in the mining sector in particular. And it's been largely ignored. And that was, again, for me, I was surprised by this, but also obviously represents an opportunity to perhaps address child labor from a different perspective. And the possible avenues for future research that these students identified as relates to child labor includes how do we reinforce women's representation, leadership, and decision-making process, looking at the highly gendered earning structure and practices of ASM, the gender barriers to accessing financing mechanisms. We talk about financial inclusion for the ASM sector, but the barriers are different for women than they are for men, and that could also factor into decisions around child labor. The social constructs that we hear a lot about, defining and generally limiting women's involvement in the mine sites. If you don't have direct access to mine sites or to the commodity, you may not have access to liquidity, or you might not have as much access to income. And so again, what are the links between that and child labor? The real costs of schooling relative to household income. When you look at all the costs, you know, school may be free, but it never really is. There's all sorts of costs that are there. So how do you actually compare those things? So really a call for, or let's say underscore the importance for more evidence-based programming that is comprehensive and evidence-based at the nexus of women's security and child labor for deeper and lasting change. And we've gone beyond to think about security now. And this is the Cobalt space in particular is making us think like this. We're not just looking at economic security, but physical security, of course. Sometimes in our financial inclusion projects, we've been very aware and conscious of how if a woman's income increases, she might actually be more vulnerable to physical assault and domestic abuse because it's maybe threatening if her male counterparts are not on board. So the importance of bringing in mitigating measures to make sure everybody is on board to avoid the risks of physical violence, social security, but also energy security. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. So next slide, please. So we are launching a small, modest project funded by the Responsible Business Alliance. And I say modest because it's a first step, a first phase. And the outcome, or let's say the output, will be a theory of change, and a theory of change that's got evidence behind it, so that we can then go to developing or influencing or informing other programming, so partners, our own, bringing that evidence and theory of change. So for better programming, not to say that there's not a lot of work that's good being done, but that we really have an evidence-based approach so we can learn and actually do better. So what we're trying to do in this project called Her Security, which is women's security as a pathway to improve livelihoods in the DRC's cobalt mining communities. And our partner in this is the Good Shepherd Foundation, and it's, like I mentioned, funded through a foundation of the Responsible Business Alliance. And what we want to do, let's say it's a research shortcut project, because we're doing some focus groups and some interviews, but it's really to validate our analysis of existing data sets. So we're working with partners to look at the type of child labor programming they've done, because we're not child labor experts, and doing the analysis and validating it with local communities and focus groups to better understand this intersection of gender and child labor. And the objective is really, as I said, to change the narrative of child labor, to really get at the root causes, to expose the root causes, and to examine that link at the intersection of women's security using an evidence-based approach. We've already heard that poverty is a big driver. And so we go back to economic security. 73% of DRC's household live under $1.90 US per day. As well, the DRC, as many of you may know, currently supplies 70% of the world's cobalt, which is critical for the green transition. So the North, the West, countries who are essentially going very rapidly towards electric vehicles and solar and dependence on lithium batteries and moving away from carbon is really dependent on the DRC for this critical mineral. But the irony, or the paradox, is that 16% of households in the DRC have access to electricity. And women who are in those households are obviously depending on, for example, charcoal, and exposing themselves to the health risks of constantly using charcoal. They're going out and cutting down trees to produce that charcoal, which has a deforestation effect, which is essentially linked back to climate change. So energy security is also important. And how does that link to child labor? So these are things we're still kind of exploring and trying to figure out. I'm not pretending we have the answers, but we're trying to unpack this at this first phase of the project. So we're looking at physical security, economic security, land security, food security, energy. So these are like, the security basket that we're trying to understand as linked to child labor in the cobalt space. Next page, please. So this is a bit, technical, but in the middle there, you see the assumptions, or the nascent theory of change that we're trying to test, which is at the root of this project. Is we're assuming that if we increase women's security, these different types of security and how is led to be, or which ones maybe are more relevant, has yet to be determined. And we assume that that's going to lead to improved livelihoods, which we assume will lead to reduced child labor. Yet to be proven, but it's a theory of change that we have. At the bottom, you see the interventions that that we're looking at. The ones on the far left are the ones that we've invested heavily in over the last, I would say, 6 years or 7 years. I'm not going to read them out, but they're obviously focused more on women's economic and political security. And at the other end, you have essentially, child protection systems, making sure they have birth registrations, free primary education. So our partners that we work with who are specialists in child labor, I would say tend to be at the right end of that spectrum. And the top are the indicators that we're using, and we're drawing from a number of existing indexes to allow us to dive deep and do the analysis of the data that we're going to pull out existing data sets from these projects in order to start to tease out how this theory of change is essentially woven together. So it's a very, it's almost like a research shortcut. We don't have a lot of financing for research, but the idea is to understand this with existing research, and again, to elevate the issue of the importance of this nexus between women's security and child labor, to understand it better, to inform better policy and programming, our own, but also partners and the ministry, family, gender, etc., and NGO partners, etc. This is information we want to make available to as many as possible. So that is what Impact is doing in this space, and we look forward to providing an update when we have more information to share. So now I would like to pass the mic to Christopher from the Alliance for Responsible Mining, who I believe is going to be talking about probably Colombia and West Africa as well, I think. So over to you, Christopher.
Thank you very much, Joanne. And I would first of all like to thank everybody for participating in this webinar, and also all the volunteers that have been involved in the development of this webinar. So my name is Christophe Anne Koulibaly, and I work for Alliance for Responsible Mining. If you want, you can help me with the next slide. So we are a Colombian-based nonprofit organization that was founded in 2004, and basically we work to facilitate the empowerment of artisanal and small-scale miners, their organization, and the adoption of good practices, promoting favorable environments for the inclusion of those miners in formal economies. So through our work, we try to generate well-being for miners, their families, and their communities, but also to reduce adverse impact of ISM on the environment. And we really try to enable ASM to be recognized in its contribution to local, international, and national economies and social development. So for this, we work on a program. If you want, you can help me with the next slide, please. That is the Sustainable Mines Program. And through a series of standards, a series of steps that we have, we work with different standards, the craft code and the fair mine standard, to help miners to achieve this leadership step, in which with the certification they really inspire other miners in order to achieving the sustainable development goals. If you can help me with the next slide, please. So as I was saying, we have two standards. The first one is the craft code, and the other one is the fair mine standard, and is through those standards that I'm going to shed the light on how we address gender dimensions of child labor in the mining sector. So just for you to have a quick view on those standards, we have the craft code that was launched in 2019, and that allows ASM producers to engage in formal markets by focusing on a management of the risks. So they basically engage in due diligence focused on human rights, and they use a progressive path to have better practices. And with the achievement of the criteria that we have on the craft code, we enable them to enter in this in the certification of fair mine standard that enable those miners to comply with more responsible practices and to also have an impact on their communities through I'm sorry for the noise. A plane was was going through. So through the achievement of the criteria of the fair mine standard, we help miners and to have a greater impact in their communities by investing in those communities, and this can be on several topics. So next slide, please. So when we're talking about this sustainable mining program, we are going to go through, into this the topic through two steps that I'm showing here. So what we do to address the risks in the mining sites, and particularly the child labor and in its gender dimensions, we first see the risks on we have risk management on the territory. So for example, John, you were mentioning that you were working on desk research to see the link between child labor and women's economic security. So, for example, these are the kind of things that we do. We also work on second sources information to articulate a lot of risks that can be impacting child labor. Then we go directly on the mining sites with social researches, with also business cases that we make to address those risks. With this diagnosis that we have made in the territory and on the mining sites, we then develop with a participative approach with the miners and also some members of the community, some improvement plans that will enable them to also achieve the criteria that we have in the standards that we have been able to develop. And then with the achievement of those criteria, they enter into a system of certification. So the craft code and the fair mine standard they deal with child labor. We have 10 criteria on which we work directly on child labor, and we have much further on the thematics that are related to gender. For example, we work on the worst form of child labor. We divide them between a series of ages. We work on child labor on the mining sites and in the communities. We work on youth employment programs, labor conditions, etc. And we are also aware that child labor this risk of child labor goes beyond the boundaries of the mining sites. This is why it's fundamental for us, and I think that Cynthia mentioned it in her presentation. The stakeholders who have an influence on this risk it's key to manage this, because without engaging with those local stakeholders, we're going to have a lot of difficulties to address the risk of child labor. And then, yes, we also identify and assess the reasons of the manifestations of child labor, and for this we use the 5-step framework of the OECD due diligence guidance. We identify the risk, we assess them, then we mitigate those risks according to what we have been able to see and what are the capabilities of the communities and the mining sites to address those risks. We put in place monitoring systems, and then we report on them. And this is I think the most important thing that we have to shed the light on here is the fact that both craft and fair mine approach consider those risks as interdependent in the ASM sectors. That is to say that you can't address the issue of child labor if you have not addressed the issue of security, or if you have not addressed the issue of gender, or if you have not addressed the issue of human rights violations in general. So this is very important because it will help us also to have better actions when we try when we work on those kind of risks. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through all of these steps so that you see a little bit more how we work on them. So first of all, as I was saying, I'm not going to go to be long on this one. As I was saying, we see we have like desk researches in which we use social techniques and to address to assess the risk, at the territorial level. So we see if there are existing complaint mechanism, if those complaint mechanism are also are gender neutral or not, if we have red flags, risks that we can see, if there are 6 stakeholders that have influence on child labor and these other risks that we are trying to cross-cut, and if there are institutional roots that are present. And with this, we have a characterization of the territory that enable us to assess the conditions or the factors that increase the risk of child labor. So the number of people who are affected, the type of consequences, depending on if we are dealing with girls or boys, their ages too. When I see that the ultimate bullet point is not, we can't see it very well, but the thing is to say that we have a sector-wide analysis of gender gaps in the mining. So we also assess legal and policy norms. We also make focus interviews on gender stereotypes and discrimination. All this to cross-cut the information between child labor and gender and the gender topics. Here, if you can go to the next slide, I will provide you a quick example. For example, in Suriname, we're working with Maroon community, and we have been able to see through those information that we have been able to gather on a desk research level, and also by making interviews and focus group, that we can cross-cut a lot of intersectional variables. For example, the fact that rich men are becoming richer with mining, and this has an influence on the fact that their behaviors are attractive to poorer young boys. And this is something that we have been able to see in this Maroon community in Suriname, is that when you see a lot of adolescent teenagers, who are getting richer, for example, that are taking the example of other men that are being richer, this is something that also attracts young boys to go in the mining sector. Also, the fact that we're talking about an ethnic group with strong social structures and heteronormative roles. That is to say that traditional leaders are men. Men have advantage to access to finance and programs to make the sector evolve their way. And this is different, for example, from some indigenous communities that are working both in Suriname and in Guyana. And for example, in this picture, you can see that when we started to introduce the project, the Mercury Phase-Out project, that is the one that we're working on in Guyana, people who are around the table are mainly men, who are the leaders of the community, and the only person who was a woman was the one who were providing for the logistics. So this is something that's also have an influence, because when we were working on this project, we saw that it sets the basis that it will be challenging to identify and specifically assess girls' role in the mining sector, and to further understand the barriers and opportunities to address the problem. And finally, yes, the gender perspective, that the association between men and heavy manual intensive labor, men can work in dirty and difficult environment, were things that were also listened from us during the interviews and all the researches that we made. So if you want, you can go to the next slide. So these were some things that we have been able to see on a territorial level, and when we went directly on the mining sites, we made some diagnosis directly This is was one of the example in Suriname, but this is what we are used to do. Sorry, we make diagnosis including a sex disaggregated using sex disaggregated data to set a baseline on the mining sites and involving the communities. So here the idea is really to have socioeconomic characterization using qualitative and quantitative information, to have basic information also of these miners, the lists, the gaps, if they also receive trainings, participation lists, etc. And we also make a diagnosis on and with a focus on worst form of child labor, considering also those sex disaggregated data. So if you want, you can go to the next slide, please. Here I will provide, for an example from Burkina Faso, in which we had, for example, a lot of information that would help really to understand what were the differences. For example, and this is something that I saw that Cynthia mentioned, about the working condition. For example, something that was seen directly on this mining site that is located in the Plateau Central in Burkina Faso. They were saying, for example, that girls were much more working into washing and basket weaving, and the boys in digging, going down into the pits, bringing up the ores from the pits, and women would work during the day, and instead men, I mean, this dealing with child labor, so girls and boys, sorry, boys would take turns between days and nights, and many girls considered the work that to be hard compared to boy. And this is, for example, when we went a little bit deeper in this analysis on the mining site, we saw that it was also because young boys were more equipped than girls because of the kind of work they were doing. So these are the kind of things that we are used to work on. About the violences, sorry, also we saw that girls were more subjected to verbal and moral violences, and also sexual violences. Boys more to physical violences, beating, physical abuses, food deprivation. And about the knowledge of the risks also, we saw that doing this baseline with sex disaggregated data, we saw that boys and girls were aware of the risks that they were facing, but girls were a bit more aware of it. And the knowledge of the rights by the community were something that was quite interesting to see, because some stereotypes could affect the knowledge of those rights for girls and boys. For example, they would say that, yes, everybody has the right to education, but it does not have the same importance for boys and girls because of this division that we have for them. And these were fathers or mothers or uncles that were saying this, because the vision that we have for their future is not the same. Or yes, we know that they have a right to health, but there are still taboos on sexual and reproductive health, or on menstruation, for example. So these are the kind of information that we go and directly collect on the mining site in order to have a better understanding on how child labor has its expressions in its gender dimensions. And finally, here, if you can go to the next slide, please. We work directly improving, working on a participative way to have improvement plan. And here, what is important to mention is the fact that we work on actions that are in the mining site and also outside the mining site. So here we have those actions in the mining site include commitments on child labor prevention, the establishing of minimum working age in different mining sites, and when we work in the communities, we mostly work on grievance mechanism or system of alerts. If you want, you can go to the next slide, please. Here you have an example, for example, in a mine that is present in Colombia, in San Roque, where we had all this work directly on the mining sites. This is a formalized mine already, but we have those statements on commitments on child labor, the establishment of a complaint mechanism, alert system. They had a lot of awareness on child labor. You can go on the next slide, please. And the idea in other parts also, this is part of one of the projects that we have been able to conduct between 2013 and 2020. That was financed by US doll, and that was led by a consortium, that was implemented by a consortium led by PACT. Here, for example, we saw all the work that we did on the mining sites, in the houses, and with community-based organization, with governmental entities, and also with educational institutions. Because this, for example, we created spaces of dialogue. We improved the economy of and protective abilities to protect children in the household. We increased formalization. These were part of the action that we carried out during this project. Next slide, please. And as Joanne mentioned in her presentation too, we are also convinced that by increasing women's security and empowerment, we also can improve those livelihoods, and by improving those livelihoods, we reduce child labor. So this is why to tackle child labor, we also work on women empowerment in the mining sector, and we work on several topics, and these have shown a real success also in several parts of Colombia, in Cauca, most of all, in which we had first of all the work on prevention of sexual harassment at work. That was things, for example, that we saw that when the mother was empowered on those issues, she would be likely to also share what she had learned during all those trainings with her children, and this was something that was quite interesting. When we were working on health and safety risks with a gender perspective, to access to mineral resources, to fight against discrimination, to work with community engagement and visibility on international platforms. This would also enable those women to have a visibility, in fact, in the community, that would open the scope of future that was given to children. So these are some things that I wanted to share with you. And the next slide, please. And these are some lessons learned and recommendation, that it's key to incorporate external variables to mining, to understand the factors that increase the risk of child labor and its gender dimensions. That is key also to have sex disaggregated data when we go and make diagnosis on those specific topic of child labor and its worst form. And it's important also to nuance the responsibility of ISM producers in causing the phenomenon, because in several countries we saw that when and this is also shown in the laws and the norms, when we create laws to tackle child labor, most of the time we also criminalize people that are in situations that are beyond their control. And the last element that I wanted to share with you is the fact that by creating alert and complaint system in collaboration with other stakeholders, we also raise awareness and we make this mechanism much more effective. So this was what I wanted to share with you today, and I hope that it will shed the light on practical ways to address gender dimension while talking about child labor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christophe. That was very rich. Thank you. It's a really good overview as well. And thank you for your tenacity over the traffic of Antioquia. coming from the skies and the road, but we heard you very clearly. So it's very well articulated as well. I have several questions, but in the interest of time, and maybe just to plant one for now while you think about it, is in terms of contextual differences from one context to another, cultural differences that to take into consideration. I think maybe we can come back to that conversation question for everybody after, but I was struck by that. Let's turn over now in the interest of time to Ya, who's going to present, I think, the case study of Ghana in particular. Ya, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you or wherever you may be. My name is Yao Brichum Opoku. I'm the Responsible Mining Program Manager for Solidaridad West Africa. And I'm going to talk about addressing child labor in the ASM sector in Ghana. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll give a brief overview of the ASM sector in Ghana and also delve into child labor in ASM in Ghana and talk about our approach to addressing the issue of child labor, and lastly conclude on the session. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, I work with Solidaridad, which is an international civil society organization working in over 50 countries globally. And we see ourselves as a supply chain organization. And what we do is that we identify challenges within the particular supply chain and come out with solutions to address those challenges. So we are more of a solution-oriented civil society organization. Our goal program is currently in East Africa, West Africa, and also in Southern America. And what we do is that we try to promote responsible practices in small-scale mines. We have 4 key pillars that we work in. The first is good practices, looking at coming up with good practice on the mine sites and also in mining communities as well. And we also look at providing some form of support to service providers so that they can provide services that helps to promote responsible practices in mines as well. Thirdly, we look at policy influencing as we're doing now. And lastly, we also look at market uptake, linking the mines to also to downstream actors as well. So basically, that's what we do with regards to our gold program. To this particular presentation, the contribution of the small-scale mining sector to gold production in Ghana has increased from 2.2% of total gold produced in 1989 to about 1/3 of total gold produced in recent years. On the average, we produce about 4 million ounces of gold every year. And so 1/3 of that is huge. So that is coming from the small-scale mining sector. We've seen sort of a transition of the sector from the use of rudimentary equipment ever since the regulations on small-scale mining came into place. They were producing just about 2.2% of gold because of the type of equipment that they were using at the time. But now they are using heavy-duty equipment, so that has helped increase production drastically. The sector employs about 1 million people in Ghana and supports about 4 million people directly. And out of that, we have about 51% being women, mainly working in alluvial mines, with men also mainly working in the hard rock mines. The sector, of course, also contributes to the SDGs, specifically SDG 1, 3, 4, 6, and also 8. Although we having lots of benefits from the sector, there are also it also has its challenges, mainly to do with environmental degradation, health and safety of mine workers, also use of mercury as well, and of course also child labor, which is also a major challenge with the sector. Next slide, please. All right, so let me just also briefly talk about child labor situation in the ASM sector in Ghana. Studies have shown that there are a number of children involved in child labor in the sector under dangerous conditions. This includes both boys and also girls, but majority of the boys are involved in the actual activity. They largely perform tasks such as digging, working in rivers, washing the ore, and also mixing the ore with mercury. So you can see the dangers that they expose themselves to. and of course also the sale of gold as well. The girls largely carry heavy loads of ore and also pound rocks into smaller pieces. And apart from the typical mine activities, they also sell food, water, etc. on the mine sites. You can see that the activities of the boys and the girls are virtually the same as what men and women do on mine sites. So it's virtually sort of a replica of that. Girls especially are also exposed to sexual abuse and also exploitation. So these I realize are similar to what's happening in Côte d'Ivoire. And so it's basically we having the same challenges as well with regards to child labor. Next slide, please. All right, so how do we address this challenge? We just recently got funding from NORAD, which is the Norwegian Development Organization, to undertake a project to address forced and child labor in cocoa and mining communities. So this is virtually the model that we are adopting under the project. Our experience as an organization has shown that initially we started using the typical supply chain approach to address child labor issues, and later realized that the issue is so complex that using just the supply chain approach wouldn't solve the problem. So then we also adopted the landscape approach, which of course helped to address most of the challenges being faced, or most of the root causes of child labor. So from my experience, we think that the best approach going forward is to combine both the supply chain approach and the landscape approach in order to address the problem holistically. And this also, of course, will involve all stakeholders, including private sector actors, governmental institutions, civil society organizations, communities, etc., traditional authority, etc. So basically, this is our new approach that we currently piloting in selected gold mining and cocoa communities in Ghana. So the first approach, looking at supply chain, I think Christophe did mention what they do under the craft code, for instance. I will later come to that. For us, we are also looking at mainly formalization. Studies have shown over the years that before you can regulate a sector, you need to first of all formalize the sector. So there is a need for us to, of course, formalize the sector first before you can then come out with due diligence approaches to address the problem. Although formalization is not really part of this project, we do have other projects that complements this particular project. So, but we think that in coming out with a model to really holistically address the issue, there's a need for us to also look at formalization so that we then, of course, after that, come out with due diligence approaches to help address the issues. So with gold mining, for instance, we are also piloting the craft code in Ghana and using that to help address child labor issues. And that, I'm not going to talk too much about that because that has been explained by Christophe. So that's typically using the supply chain approach. But we are not doing that for only mining or for only gold, but also doing that for cocoa as well. So this project is looking at two different sectors, all in the same landscape. So we selected communities that have both cocoa and gold mining as the major activities. So the due diligence approach that we're using is targeting both cocoa cooperatives and also ASM mines as well. The third component of this particular approach is also trying to advocate for the use of due diligence to address key challenges being faced by the sector, and specifically, of course, with child labor as well. So apart from we just piloting these approaches, we also try to advocate for other organizations to also ensure that they promote due diligence in their operations as well. So this is basically what we do under the supply chain approach. Now to the landscape approach. We realized that the major challenge to do with the major root cause of child labor is poverty, but of course that also has other related causes as well. And so for us in addressing child labor issues in mining or cocoa communities, we need to come out with strategies to help address poverty. So with this, what did we do to address that as a project? We set up what we call the Village Savings and Loans Associations, and we targeted women within the mining community. So about 80% of the members of the Village Savings and Loans Associations are women. Why women? Because we are based on the other presentations that we've had today, realize that they are key in addressing the problem of child labor. So our poverty alleviation intervention also tries to target more women, so that once they have improved incomes, of course, there'll be a high probability of they sending their children to school. So we formed Village Savings and Loans Associations, and in one other project that we piloted some time back, we also had a revolving fund as well as a top-up to their savings, so that when, let's say, they save monies and it's not adequate to start businesses or to improve on their businesses, they get a top-up amount using their revolving fund to help get adequate resources to either expand or start new businesses altogether, with the main objective of trying to improve on their incomes, and they using their incomes to support their children's education. So that's specifically to do with the trying to address poverty, but of course that also comes with other landscape issues or local issues as well, trying to also engage with typical governmental institutions to help address the problem. So the next with that is to do with social services. How do we ensure that people in these communities have access to social services? One is looking at adequacy of those social services, or whether they do even have those social services. And when they do, how do we ensure that they have easy access to some of these social services, including schools, health, education, health, etc. So of course, also we need to educate them for them to also know that there are these services being provided at the local level, so that they can also, and these are the requirements for accessing those services as well. So we try to also educate them on social services within their areas as well, so they can then have easy access to some of these services. We also realized that one of the challenges being faced was to do with the institutions at both the local and also the national level, and the institutions that are responsible for ensuring that there's no child labor within communities. Realized that they have very low capacity. So as part of the project, we're trying to build the capacity of these institutions so they can provide the needed services in order to ensure that there's no child labor within their areas of jurisdiction. The fourth component is looking at policy influencing. We try to influence policy at both the international, national, and also local levels to ensure that government provides the necessary resources for ensuring that children are able to go to school. So we try to influence policy as well in order to ensure that the districts or the local communities do have the necessary infrastructure in order to support, in order to ensure that the children are able to go to school. Because if, let's say, you've educated a community member on the need for them to send their children to school, and there's no school within the community, and of course, it's very challenging for them to do that. That's why we need this approach, which is quite comprehensive, to ensure that we have all these services being provided at the local level. We also do some form of awareness raising, which of course is a bit related to policy influencing. We try to raise awareness at both the national and also local levels on the services that are available, and also on the need for them to ensure that they don't engage in child labor activities. Also ensuring that they have institutions that try at both the national and local level that helps to reduce child labor within these communities. So we use media, for instance. We also have direct engagement with mining communities to raise awareness. We use posters, etc., to raise awareness on child labor issues within these communities. And lastly, we look at remediation. We try to support those who have been in child labor. We try to take them out to school based on the project. Also, so the project is also supporting them to take them out of that. So we try to do that as well. So this is basically the approach that we are adopting at the landscape level, whereby we're looking at two sectors or the key sectors within the particular area of jurisdiction, and also combining that with the supply chain approach. And we believe that these two, combining these two approaches will help address child labor or eradicate child labor within the mining community. So this is our approach to addressing the problem. Next slide, please. All right, so based on the discussion so far, we would like to conclude that the complex nature of child labor requires a multi-sectoral approach that involves all key stakeholders such as governmental institutions, communities, private sector actors, and also traditional authorities, civil society organizations, etc. So because it's very complex, you need to address it holistically, because there are even some taboos, etc., that will even not encourage people to send their children to school. So of course, you need to also target the traditional authority as well. So it's very complex, and of course, the solutions should also be complex. That's why we have we are implementing both the supply chain and also the landscape approaches. We also believe that strategies should include addressing the underlying causes of poverty and creating an enabling environment for children to go to school. The underlying cause of poverty might be different in various jurisdictions. So that must be really assessed to really understand what really causes poverty within a particular area that we're working in. Then based on that, you know the types of interventions to come out with to be able to address the issues. Then of course, there's also the need to create an enabling environment for children to go to school as well, ensuring that they have adequate infrastructure. School fees are not too expensive so that parents will be able to pay for their children's school fees. So access is, when we talk of access, we are looking at both the physical access and also the financial access as well, and to ensure that the children are able to go to school. Then lastly, empowerment of women as change makers is key to eradicating child labor. I think Joanne did talk about women's security. This is a bit related to that, ensuring that women are empowered not only economically, but also looking at physical, social, and other factors as well, so that they'll be able to support in eradicating child labor in their areas or in their communities. There's also the need for gender organizations to play a role in helping to eradicate child labor issues within communities. And of course, these organizations could help support with either supply chain approaches or landscape, or combining the two, which we think should be the way forward. Thank you very much. And I'll be, of course, willing to respond to any questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Ya. Also very comprehensive and very rich. It's wonderful that we have 2 hours, because you all could go quite in depth on the subject matter in the various jurisdictions. I tossed out a question to Christophe, which I will come back to in a second, but I have another one right now at the top of my mind that I don't want to lose the thread. While the participants think about questions to post in the chat, because we are also expecting you to engage with the presenters via the chat, so we're waiting for your questions. So what struck me in everyone's presentation is underscoring the importance of a comprehensive approach. It's a complex issue, multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral, so it's not uniquely supply chain. Whether it's jurisdictional, landscape, thinking about the complexity by which a household lives day to day, and poverty as well, how it's fundamentally threatening the security of those households. So there's that kind of development approach for sure that's important. Married, we heard very much with the economics, the supply chain. Cynthia talked about these stakeholders, not only the families themselves who are bringing their children to mines, and women out of economic necessity or due to insecurity, but let's call them these stakeholders, supply chain actors, who are there essentially to exploit children because they will get a greater margin because kids are cheap in labor. And I would argue, women are also a cheaper form of labor typically. So my question is, we've talked about poverty alleviation as an approach, and that clearly has a gender face, a gender element. But how do we get to this issue of economic margins to remove or disincentivize those actors who want to continue exploiting children? So I think a lot of the solutions that we explore, all of us, are at the household level, the community level. We talk about supply chains, but ultimately those actors in the supply chain are looking to increase their margins. So how to dissuade them from relying on children, especially at the formalization stage when there's not yet any international buyers or that standards aren't fully realized. How to ensure that those actors stop using kids to make more money, essentially, and how to bring them under the fold. So that's my question. And where does gender come into that? With regards to margins and the role of traders and buyers, because they are, as Cynthia said, stakeholders who are benefiting from the status quo. So we might have a lot of influence at the community level as development actors, but what about those actors who may also be linked to illicit or informal or illegal supply chains? So that's my question, my first question to each of you. How about we start with Ya? You were the last speaker, so I'm going to ask you first. We'll go backwards. So Ya, do you have a response to that or some thoughts?
Yes, I do. So that's why from our model, we think that there is a need for us to ensure that they are able to formalize the operations, because generally, if it's in quotes illegal, then it's very difficult for you to regulate the activities. And also, we did also propose that we look at institutions, be it at the national level or the local level. We need to build their capacity for them to ensure that they regulate the sectors. So typically, to do with that, one example could be if, let's say, of course, they do have the capacity to monitor such operations to ensure that there's no child labor, then of course that will help address the problem. So it's about looking at the institutions, empowering them, building the capacity to be able to address issues. And of course that is also sustainable as well, because this project, for instance, is a 3-year project. We can't be there forever. So that's why it's key that we capacitate these institutions for them to undertake their roles effectively. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just going to be a little bit provocative and say that, formalization and regulating the sector often actually eats into margins as well, because then you have to pay taxes and fees and other payments. And so it's the issue of economic margins that, that is perhaps driving, it's those, that microeconomy of relying on child labor. So I'm not entirely convinced, I have to say, that regulating or formalizing the sector is going to increase the margins automatically of supply chain actors. I think it's still more attractive to rely on cheap labor. But next, Cynthia, I saw your hand up. Do you want to wade in?
Yeah. For me, I think we should first understand the logic of these different stakeholders, because when we implement strategies and projects, we only focus on the targeted population. But sometimes, like in the case of child labor, the targeted population doesn't have the whole decision-making power. So we have to understand the logic of the stakeholder who get the power, who get the decision first, and try to find other strategies, some palliative strategies to address their problem. Because if we don't address the problem of the important stakeholder, all the strategies we put in place will not be sustainable, because the important stakeholder that don't get the interest in the activity. So for me, understand the logic of the logic and understand how they act and how they think is, for me, the key to address efficiently the issue of child labor.
Yeah, that's fascinating. This issue of what motivates, you know, the incentives, and if we look at those, you know, important stakeholders that are maybe driving demand for children in the sector, that again are women the part of that group? What are the gender dimensions? I think there's a lot to explore there. It's a whole new set of questions that I think is still underexplored. Christophe, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. On my side, I would take both of the answers that have been given. I think that formalization is something that can help really, because of the fact that when we achieve formalization with mining sites, the regulation, I mean, not the regulation, but all the regulatory bodies that are seen at the mining sites are much more aware and much more focused on what they have to do. So this due diligence approach that gathers those regulatory bodies, the mining sites, and also community members, in fact, is something that can help a lot to mitigate this risk. And the fact that we also be aware of the motivation of each of the stakeholders who are using those margin is something that, to me, it's key. On my side, I think that something that would be complementary to those answers that have been given is the fact that I have been facing, or at least the let's say that the experience we had on child labor, and to create those system of alerts through complaint mechanism in which all of the stakeholders are part of, is something that has been key. For example, in Burkina Faso, in Plateau Central, when we have created those committees in which you had a religious leader, the chief, the authority, the traditional chief, you had the representative of the mining site, you had also some buyers, you had other community members who are women representative, the representative of the association of youth, for example. All those persons were in the same table and were talking about this issue. In fact, you had all the eyes were put on child labor. So people know that if there is a problem that is faced on the mining sites, everybody will be aware of it. So creating those system of alerts, integrating into complaint mechanism, all of the stakeholders who are part of the supply chain. And when I say supply chain, to me, it's the whole community, is something that could be really, really effective to address child labor in its gender dimension.
Right.
Gender dimensions.
Yeah. And I appreciate again how everybody has said, and you've reiterated stuff, that artisanal mining in particular is a whole ecosystem. I think many of the approaches up to this point have been focused on supply chains, and we are all talking about the importance of looking at it as an ecosystem for solutions. Otherwise, we're not going to get ahead. So I think we're all on the same page there. I'd like to draw your attention to a question from Doris Buss in the chat. She's asking about how you each define child and how you define child labor. And then talk about if you have different strategies for different age sets, essentially, or age categories. Anybody want to go first? Or shall I pick on somebody?
If you want, I can go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Seth.
Well, the definition of a child is something that is very complex, because as I was mentioning also in my presentation, we are facing groups that are very different. For example, when you go into the communities, I think that the first thing that we have to do is also to understand how people understand the concept of children before us going to tackle an issue that is related. You know, if we're not on the same page on who are the children, sorry, it's going to be very difficult to tackle the issue. So for example, in some communities, they would say that when a girl has her first menstruation, she is a woman. So she's no more a children. When a boy has faced his some traditional practices to become a man, he is a man. So from this stage, if we are not on the same page on who are children, sorry, it's going to be very difficult for us to address the issue. The thing is that we have to understand this and also make people aware of the fact that there are some norms, international norms, national norms that define children as people who are under 18 years old. So I think that the struggle is here to cross-cut the perspective of those community on who is a child, and those international norms that we have to also comply with to define who are children or not. And regarding the second question, that is the strategies that are used according to the categories of those who are under 18 years old, we also work on it. For example, in the craft code, I told you that we had 10 criteria on child labor, and when we're talking about this criteria, we differentiate, for example, people who are under 15 years old and people who are between 15 and 18 years old. This is also because when you're 15 years old, you have several, according to different legal systems, you have some youth employment program that are given by some regulations. So, for example, if you're working in a particular, if you are doing a particular activity in the mining sector, you can beneficiate from the local government for an internship, for example, or a program that is given. It depends on those regulations that are different in these countries. So this is what I could say here.
Thank you, Christophe. Does either Ya or Cynthia go ahead, and then maybe Ya, you can add a few words if you'd like.
Thank you, Joanne. As Koulibaly said, there is international definition of children which is under 18, and also international definition of child labor. But in some community, especially in rural community, child labor is considered as a part of education. Making children do housework, making children go to the field, help their parents, is considered as part of education. It is not the same vision of child labor. So this definition of each part of the piece, if I can say like this, is very important, because what is defined as child labor by international norms is not perceived as child labor by the community. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have the same perception of child labor, it will be difficult to address the problem. I take an example for a girl who is grown up in a community, cooking, washing plates, cleaning the house, spending much time in doing housework is considered as normal. And we all, when I say we, I think about myself, we all have been grown out in this kind of community. So explain to the community that help the parents in the mining site, help the parents in the cocoa culture, cannot be understood as a child labor. And the question of definition is an important issue to address the problem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. And I think you answered the question that's in the chat around, where do you draw the line? Because children work alongside their parents. It's a fact of life and even an expectation. So you're both speaking to kind of, social constructs versus legal constructs and the challenge of navigating that in interpretation and implementation and application. Yeah, did you have something to add on this point?
Yes, I do. I think to explain this, it will be good to virtually differentiate between child work, child labor, and worst forms of child labor. You need to really differentiate between these three. And just to summarize, child work will be socialization, for instance. Child labor will be more of generally interfering with the school, with a child's school. Anything that interferes with a child's school is classified virtually as child labor, just to summarize. And lastly, looking at worst forms of child labor, that looks at hazardous activities, which of course, generally in the mining sector, of course, they are all exposed to that. So it's good to differentiate between these three. Yeah, thank you.
Very good, thank you. I want to go back to the issue of maybe geographic differences or let's say cultural differences, because you've all been working in different contexts and most of you have worked across contexts. And so it would be good to know what approaches, marrying gender and